There's nothing like a good revenge story. In fact, some of the best movies, the plot line is all connected to, well, revenge. And when we think about these revenge stories and revenge movies, there's these iconic lines that, well, we all know to this day. Take, for instance, Scarface, the actor, Al Pacino, when he says, well, say hello to my little friend, right? Or the moment in, Gladiator, when he goes, my name is Maximus Decimus Meridius. I mean, what a name. He goes, father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife. Oh, and I will have my vengeance in this life or the next. Or probably the most famous of all movie lines spoken by, Clint Eastwood, when he goes, go ahead and make my day. There's nothing like a revenge story. In fact, in all of our lives, we like a good revenge story. I mean, you're driving down the highway and you're going 75 miles an hour, and then that car cuts you off. That car kind of nudges you off. That car starts to slow down. That car, and you're just so frustrated with that car, and all of a sudden they speed off. And miles down the road, you see the lights, and as you get closer, you realize it's that car, and they've gotten pulled over, and you think to yourself as you pass them, they got what they deserve. You're frustrated at work. There's that one boss, that one employee that's driving you nuts. Finally, you had enough. You quit. And weeks, months, years later, you hear that they got fired, and you think to yourself, they got what they deserved. You're in a marriage, and it's going great, and then you discover that she has cheated on you, and you're like, how could they do that? You separate, you divorce, you go your own ways, and then they find a new love, and they get married, and all of a sudden, one day, you hear that they got cheated on, and you think to yourselves, they got what they deserved. And where does that lead us? I mean, again, we love a good revenge story. But where does revenge really lead? Does it lead to happiness? Does it lead to fullness? Does it lead to better relationships? Or does it lead to more brokenness and more hurt and more bitterness? Well, we're in this series. It's actually the fourth and final part of the series, Immovable. And we've been looking at, different storms that crash into all of our lives. In part one, we looked at the storm of relational ambush, and the encouragement was to, don't retaliate, but recalibrate. Part two, we looked at the storm of temptation's assault. Temptation wants you to say yes, but you got to know your no. You got to establish guardrails, and sometimes you just need to run. Part three, we looked at the storm of unfair circumstances. And just because you don't see what God is doing does not mean that God isn't moving. And today, the fourth and final part, we're going to be looking at the fourth storm, which is, seek revenge. The storm is going to beg us, actually set the scenario to get us to, seek revenge. And all of us, again, like a good revenge story, but where does that lead us? To more hurt, more brokenness, more bitterness. And God says there's a different way to handle the moments when we want to get even, when we want to get back. There's a better way that leads to fullness, to the life He has designed for us. Well, we've been following along with this storyline of a guy named Joseph. And where we left off in part 3 was this incredible kind of mountaintop moment for Joseph, where he had interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Hey, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." I mean, Joseph is now the number 2 most powerful person in the known world. Pharaoh being number 1, now he's the number 2. I mean, all of Pharaoh's power has been placed upon Joseph's shoulders. And remember, Joseph had interpreted the 2 dreams from Pharaoh. The first dream was all about 7 years of abundance, that there's going to be 7 great years where the harvest will be plentiful, but there's going to be 7 years of famine. And this is not just going to be some like semi-bad famine. This is going to be a severe, horrible famine. So Joseph, in charge, for 7 years, he makes sure that they stored up as much grain as possible because Joseph knew that the famine was going to come. And the famine finally hit. And we're told that the entire world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was what? So severe everywhere. But Joseph, under his leadership, they were ready to feed as many people as they possibly could. Well, as this famine swept across the land, Joseph's dad, Jacob, was trying to figure out how he was going to feed his family. Remember, Jacob thinks that Joseph is dead. Jacob thinks that his son Joseph is long gone. He has no framework that maybe, just maybe, he's still alive. So one day, Jacob going, how am I going to feed my family? How am I going to feed my sons and their wives and their kids? How am I going to take care of them? He learns that there's grain in Egypt, and he looks at his sons and says, hey, why do you just keep on looking at each other? We got to do something about this. He continues, he goes, I've heard that there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die. This is like one of those no-duh moments from dad to sons. It's like, hey, if we don't do something, we're going to die. And that plan sounds horrible, so we should do something. So go to Egypt, and you got to try to get some food. So they set off to Egypt to try to get some food. And I think that journey to Egypt had to be a little emotionally conflicting for all of them, because they remembered when they sold their brother Joseph off into slavery that those slave traders were headed to, Egypt. And somewhere in the back of their minds, they had to be thinking to themselves, whatever happened to Joseph? But I'm sure the next thought was, I'm sure he's dead, because slaves didn't live that long. Well, they get to Egypt, and they try to figure out how to get some of this grain, and everyone said, hey, there's one person in all of Egypt that's responsible to release grain to people. You got to go talk to him. So they go to talk to that one person. Oh, by the way, it's Joseph. But they don't recognize him. Why? Because it's been years and years and years, and Joseph looks, very different. Plus, I think they just assumed he was dead. Why? Because slaves don't live that long. But Joseph sees them walking his way. And Joseph, he recognized them. And we're told that as soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he did recognize them, but he pretended. He pretended not to know them, and he spoke harshly to them. Where do you come from? He asked. Now, you have to pause there and go, well, why did he speak harshly? I think Joseph in that moment was just a real, raw human being. I think in that moment, he saw this group of people coming. As they got closer, he realized it was his brothers, those who sold him into slavery, those who tried to plot to have him killed. I think there was all of this emotion, and Joseph didn't know what to do. Why? Because the storm of revenge was crashing down upon him. And he was just trying to go, what am I going to do now? What am I going to say now? And Joseph, being the number 2 most powerful person in all the known world, could have done anything he wanted to do. And then all of a sudden, the story starts to unfold. Actually, you could read all of it. It's chapters 42 through chapter 50. And I would encourage you to read through all of it, because it's quite fascinating what Joseph specifically does. But there's one thing I kind of want to highlight. You can read about it in chapter 45, but it reveals the work that God was doing within Joseph. Again, when he first saw him, he spoke harshly. But I think God started to whisper. I think God started to kind of warn Joseph, hey, Joseph, there's 2 paths here. Are you going to take the path of revenge? And that's going to lead to more hurt and more brokenness and more bitterness. It's a cancer. It'll eat you up from the inside out. It'll impact every relationship you have. Or are you going to take the better path? The more difficult path, but the better path. Which one are you going to do? So one day, Joseph realized he had to come clean with his brothers. He had to let his brothers know who he really was. So that day, he looks at his brothers, and they still don't know that it's Joseph, the brother they tried to kill. But Joseph looks at his brothers. He goes, hey, so I am Joseph. Is dad still alive? I mean, that was the question, because Joseph missed his dad. Joseph longed to eat breakfast with his dad again. Joseph longed to have a long afternoon conversation with dad. I mean, he misses his dad. And so he goes, hey, I'm Joseph, by the way, and his dad alive, and his brothers they weren't able to answer him. Why? Well, I wouldn't know what to say in that moment either. I mean, I wouldn't know what to say because of all the guilt from selling him into slavery. And, oh, by the way, Joseph is the number 2 most powerful person in the known world, and they're standing in front of him. They had no idea how to answer him. They were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, hey, come close to me. And they hesitantly stepped up to him. And he goes, I'm your brother, Joseph, the one you sold as a slave into Egypt. But then what Joseph says next, it is how you battle the storm of revenge. And I think this is the work that God had been doing within Joseph for years. I think this is the work that God had been doing within Joseph as he continued to whisper and say, hey, Joseph, see what I see. When God would whisper to Joseph, hey, Joseph, I'm going to guide you. I'm going to direct your steps. Just stay one small step behind me. Hey, Joseph, just see what I see. Hey, Joseph, see what I see. Hey, Joseph, see what I see. I know you want to see what you want to see, but Joseph, I'm doing something different. And all of a sudden, it's almost like Joseph opens his mouth and God just speaks right through him. He goes, and now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me. You sold me, but that's not the storyline. The real storyline is that God sent me. You're focused on the fact that you sold me. No. That's not yours to claim, because God was moving and God was doing something beyond you. God sent me here. And Joseph goes on, so then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He reframed the whole storyline. It has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with God. He made me father to Pharaoh, Lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. Well, the story continues. It's a really powerful story. Again, I'd encourage you to, read chapters 42 through 50. I mean, in chapter 46, Jacob is making his way to Egypt to see his long-lost son, the son he thought was dead, and the son that he's now discovered is the number 2 most powerful person in the known world. And God says something to Jacob that is so foundational to the storyline in the Bible. You need to read it. It's chapter 46. In chapter 49, Jacob, before he dies, he speaks a blessing to his sons. And one son in particular, his name was Judah. He gives this blessing that starts to build the framework around, a coming king, a coming Messiah that was going to rule not just a nation, but to rule over all nations. Well, Joseph generously gives food to his dad and to his brothers. Joseph steps in, faces those who wanted him dead, and Joseph saves their lives. And then one day, Jacob only dies. And this created a lot of tension. It created tension, why? Because, whenever we lose a loved one, grief creates so much tension within all of us, right? Grief is such a powerful emotion that we need to pay attention to. We need to look at. We need to recognize the layers of grief that will kind of come up within us as we face loss. But the other intensifying factor was this: several thousand years ago, the father figure was the leader, was the one that held everything together, was the one that made all decisions, was the one that protected, was the one that was the absolute decision maker. The father was that position. And now with that person gone, there's kind of a leadership vacuum, especially when Joseph, the number 2 most powerful person in the known world, and his brothers were, understandably pretty nervous. And we're told that when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? What if Joseph seeks revenge? What if Joseph comes after us? What if? But Joseph knew something that we have to understand. You see, when you hold a grudge, you can't hold anything else. When you hold a grudge, it consumes all your thinking. When you hold a grudge, it consumes every little space within your heart. When you hold a grudge, it's what you focus on. Because when you hold a grudge, you're thinking about one thing: you deserve it, and I'm going to get you back. You deserve it, and I'm going to get my revenge. And that's why you have to realize, where does revenge lead again? To more hurt, more brokenness. Bitterness rapidly grows, and bitterness is a cancer, and it will infect every part of you and those relationships connected to you. And Joseph knew this. And Joseph realized the position of power he was in. And Joseph realized he could do something. But his brothers kind of had a plan. Because you see, his brothers, Dad had said something to them. And so they sent this message, this word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you were to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers and the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now, please, forgive the sins of the servants of the God, of your father. Hey, Joseph, forgive. Hey, Joseph, I know you might not want to. Just let it go. Hey, Joseph, I know you could use your position and crush them, but don't. Forgive. And that's how you counteract the storm of revenge. You got to forgive. You see, forgiveness is giving up my right to hurt you for hurting me. That's what forgiveness is. I'm going to choose to let go. I'm going to choose to not get my revenge. I'm going to choose. I know you've hurt me, but I'm going to give up my right to getting back at you. It's my choice. Because you see, forgiveness is also canceling your debt, because I know the debt to God is canceled for me. You see, it is the image of the cross. where you realize that Jesus chose to die to cancel your debt, to cancel my debt. To say, my grace covers you. I mean, Jesus modeled for us an image of forgiveness that we could never reach. And I think in that moment, God used these words from Jacob, who was dead, to say, hey, Joseph, forgiveness is the right path. Hey, Joseph, even if you're thinking about it, don't listen to the storm of revenge. And how does Joseph respond? When Joseph hears the message, we're told that he weeps. I think he was just overwhelmed. I think the number of conversations Joseph had in his head, the number of moments, the dark moments. Remember, Joseph was human, right? It's how do we respond to the thoughts of revenge in our head? How do we respond to the thoughts of I'm going to get back at you? It's what do we do with the thoughts that roll in our heads? And I think for Joseph, he was trying to do the right thing. And how many times Joseph's to say, hey, God, I want to see what you see. God, I want to follow you, so guide me, direct me. I'm going to stay one small step behind you. I think over and over again, and also it was like the last moment where the storm of revenge comes crashing in one more time. Dad is gone. All that grief is welling up within him. And all of a sudden he's like, man, I could do it now. And all of a sudden God was like, no, Joseph. You got to let go completely. You got to forgive. Well, his brothers came to Joseph and they threw themselves down before him. And he says, hey, we're your slaves. We're your property. We're not worth anything. We're just going to come beg in front of you. And Joseph looks at them in the eyes and says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I'm not going to use my position of power against you. I'm not going to use my position of influence against you. I'm not going to leverage me against you. He goes, am I in the place of God? I mean, God's here. God is with me. And I've been trying to honor God every step along this journey. I've been trying to pursue God in every step along this journey. And I don't want to take my eyes off of God now. And then, looking them each in the eyes, he goes, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Your intentions were bad. Your intentions were evil. But God can take anything and work it for his good, for those who are called according to his purpose. Now, years and years later, the Apostle Paul sat down to write this letter to a church located in the ancient city of Rome. And Paul was just trying to give some very practical insight and wisdom, a framework for the storm of revenge. I mean, it hasn't changed across the span of humanity. I mean, we all like a good revenge story. We like it to this day. They liked it 1,000 years ago. And guess what? People 2,000 years in the future are still going to love a good revenge story. So Paul sits down to script out this pathway to say, hey, when you want to seek revenge, when the storm clouds of revenge are crashing into your world, and guess what? Maybe someone has done something so evil to you, this is how you respond. So he sits down and he goes, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Do not's clear. Anyone is clear. And he goes, evil for evil. Whatever the evil might be, just don't. choose not to. You have a choice. Are you going to repay them or not? And he goes, do not. He goes, be careful to do what is right in the eyes of what? Everyone. Everyone. Again, he's just like as broad as he can get. It's like, don't repay. Be careful. Do what is right. I simply wrote these two phrases. When wronged, do right. If you don't hear anything, if you don't memorize anything, memorize that. When wronged, do right. When someone wrongs you, your number one response, I'm going to do the right thing. When someone hurts me, I'm going to do the right thing. When someone betrays me, I'm going to do the right thing. When someone cuts me off on the highway, I'm going to do the right thing. When wronged, do right. That's your number one response. That's how you battle the storm clouds of revenge. You're just going to commit to, no matter how evil, how dark, how wrong it might be, you're going to say, God, I want to do the right thing. If it is possible, Paul writes, as far as it depends on you, as far as it depends on me, live what? Live at peace. With who? Everyone. That's the commitment. So when you're wrong, you're going to do the right thing. And what's the right thing? I'm going to choose peace. When they shove chaos into my life, I'm going to choose peace. When they shove hurt into my life, I'm going to choose peace. When they lie, peace. Betrayal, peace. Cheat on, peace. Manipulation, peace. Narcissistic behavior, peace. My commitment, my pursuit is peace. That's what doing right looks like. He goes on, he goes, do not, clear, take revenge. Can't get any clearer. When the storm clouds of revenge come crashing into you, begging you, tempting you, trying to get you to get your revenge, don't. Just don't. That's a commitment that you can make right now. I'm not going to. Whatever the wrong is, whatever the hurt is, whatever the evil is, whatever the name attached to that person, no matter what, I'm going to choose to do the right thing. I'm going to choose peace. I'm going to choose not to exact my revenge. Because do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for who? For God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge. I will repay. I will repay. See, ultimately, it's God's to deal with. That's why God says, hey, don't. Let me deal with it. What we're called to do is to do the right thing, to live at peace, to not exact our vengeance. God says, I'll take care of the rest. That's mine to own. What's yours to own, what's mine to own, it's peace. On the contrary, Paul writes, and I love this phrase, on the contrary, because he's like, I know what the world looks like around you. I know how other people are choosing to live. It's no different 2,000 years ago when Paul was writing this, and no different to this day, right? The rest of the world is saying, yeah, get back at people, seek your own revenge, right? Right? Like, hey, it's yours to even the score. And Paul's like, no, on the contrary, as Christ followers, we are called to live a different way. On the contrary, we are called out to live differently. Because if your enemy is hungry, feed them. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. So don't seek revenge, but seek opportunities. This is what I wrote. Seek opportunities to put love into action. That's what Paul's saying. Don't just say you love your enemies. Actually physically put love into action. And as you actually put love into action by serving the people you don't want to serve, by serving the people that have hurt you, that have wronged you, that you want to seek revenge to, the antidote to wanting to seek revenge is put love into action and serve them. And he goes, and if you do that, you'll heap burning coals on their head. And now the exact kind of illustration got lost over time. What did it actually mean to heap coals on their head? But a famous Christian leader, spiritual leader, John Calvin, he framed that phrase into two things, that it's going to soften the heart, and sting. I use the word tension. He goes, hey, heaping coals on their head, it will soften their heart and sting them. It will create some tension. And guess what? Tension gets your attention. And then Paul ends by saying, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So, when the storms come your way, whatever storm they might be, what God has called us to do is to stand firm and surge forward. What God has encouraged us to do is to build our foundation, because the storms, not if, but when they come our way, they're going to come with a ferocity and duration. We must have our foundation built strong, but also he wants us to follow him, to surge forward, because sometimes it's in the biggest of storms that God can do the greatest things in us and through us. So when you see the storm clouds, don't hunker down. Don't go hide. But say, hey, God, I want to see what you see. Guide me, direct me. I want to stay one small step behind thee. Let's pray. Lord, may we put this into practice. May we put this into practice. Building our foundation and readying ourselves so we can surge forward no matter what the storm is. So that, Lord, we will reflect your heart. That we'll place love into action. That will ultimately draw people to you. Lord, may we see what you see. Guide us, direct us. And may we all stay one small step behind thee. In your name I pray.